Liam Byrne was sentenced to 5 years. His first jail term that he served in more than 2 decades. His son tweeted, "Get in there," put on Instagram, "Get in there. I love you, Dad. See you soon." Obviously delighted with the jail term his father has faced. It maybe does seem quite small.
It does, I suppose, but I mean, in a way, this was all about Bomber Kavanagh directing this operation, and he gets the heftier term while recognising he's on a big, long sentence. We'll come on to the exact sentencing now. It's quite complicated, but we'll come on to it a bit. But from what I can see, Kavanagh gets an extra 3 years on top of what he's serving, the 21. He'll be out on licence at some point. So it just brings his total jail term to 24 years, essentially, which is hefty.
Yeah, it's a long one.
Yeah. So it's for two different. And in actual fact, when the court started, Judge Katz began by directly speaking to Thomas Kavanagh, who was on a screen, by the way. They didn't come to court this morning. None of them. They came in remotely into the courtroom, and which made things a little bit less hassly there this morning. There wasn't the security. There was a lot of security actually still, but not as bad as yesterday. But he started by directly speaking to Thomas Kavanagh. He said, "You, Thomas Kavanagh, were involved in a large importation of cocaine into the UK, and that was Operation Hornstay, which he was jailed for that 21 years for." He said to him, "You were arrested for those offences, and in January of 2019, the house was searched, I think, and they found this pink stun gun. So on the 2nd of September 2019, he was jailed for the unrelated firearms offences, which is that pink stun gun that was found." So they said that he had a previously suspended sentence for fraud activity, which was also reactivated at that time. Anyway, Operation Hornstay, the investigation sort of went on. And at that point, he approached the NCA, the National Crime Agency, with information about firearms. And all the while was sort of delaying Hornstay through the courts because he took out a Newton hearing and he was sort of holding back on his guilty plea, etc. They talk about how there was this EncroChat hack in April of 2020, and the conspiracy was sort of discovered on that hack as they talked about getting weapons, and they talked about how they were going to source them and dump them in order for...
The cameras were focused on the pitch until one man in the crowd stole the moment. A man who wasn't supposed to be there, Liam Byrne, the Irish gang boss who vanished behind prison walls, now suddenly back in public, smiling at a Liverpool match. For years, his name was whispered through backrooms and border crossings. A ghost in designer clothes, a man whose reach stretched from Dublin to Dubai. Yet tonight he wasn't hiding. He was here, bold, relaxed, almost defiant. What deal brought him back into the light? Who pulled the strings to let a man with blood and fear in his shadow walk out free? And why now? Why this match, this moment, this city? Something about his return doesn't feel like coincidence. It feels like a message. A reminder that power never really disappears. It just changes its seat. Before we begin, subscribe if you follow Irish and UK organized crime cases, because this one rewrites the rulebook. Crumlin, Dublin. A place where childhood dreams and criminal legacies often shared the same streets. Liam Byrne was born into a neighborhood that wore both poverty and pride like armor. His father, James "Jaws" Byrne, was already a name whispered in pubs and police stations, known for his counterfeiting schemes and his ability to turn chaos into quick money. For Liam, crime wasn't a rebellion, it was inheritance. In those narrow lanes and concrete estates, he learned that loyalty could buy protection, and fear could buy silence. By his teenage years, he had already traded football matches for car thefts and school books for street deals. What began as petty hustles soon evolved into something darker, something systematic, something that would place him at the center of Ireland's most powerful criminal dynasty. As the 1990s unfolded, Dublin's underworld began to change shape. Heroin flowed freely, and money was no longer made on street corners. It was built through networks, deals, and brutal enforcement.
Liam adapted fast.
He organized protection rackets around pubs and nightclubs, offering security that came with a threat. When fists didn't work, baseball bats did. Those who refused to pay learned that the Byrne name didn't just carry weight, it carried consequence. And yet, beyond the violence, there was calculation. Liam understood the currency of fear, but he also understood business. It was that combination that caught the attention of Daniel Kinahan, a rising figure who was beginning to transform small-time Dublin dealers into international traffickers with global reach. Through Kinahan, Liam found a new blueprint: crime without chaos, structure without sympathy. Their connection was more than friendship. It was opportunity wrapped in blood. Byrne's family became part of a wider network, a branch of what would later be known as the Kinahan Cartel. His cousin, Freddie Thompson, was already climbing the ranks, earning a reputation for his ruthlessness. His younger brother, David Byrne, became his right hand, steady, loyal, and feared. Together, they turned Dublin 8 into their fortress, backed by money, muscle, and foreign connections. But every empire has enemies, and theirs would come from across the city. The Hutch family, old rivals who believed the Byrnes had grown too rich, too reckless, too powerful. What followed was a feud that would define a generation of Irish crime and leave bodies scattered between Dublin and Spain. Then came the day that changed everything: the 2016 Regency Hotel shooting. David Byrne was gunned down in broad daylight, a bloody retaliation that shook the Irish underworld to its core. The images of his body lying lifeless outside the boxing weigh-in marked not just a murder but a declaration of war. For Liam, it was no longer about business. It was vengeance. He vanished from the streets, but his network tightened. Cars, properties, and money laundering operations shifted quietly to the UK. Byrne Customs and Kulak Motors became fronts for something far larger, funneling millions through deals that appeared legitimate on paper but reeked of organized deception. Grief hardened into strategy, and the man who once ruled Dublin's nightclubs now moved through Britain's shadows, protected by loyalty and silence. When the feud spilled across borders, it wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was survival. Liam Byrne was no longer a Dublin gangster. He had become an international fugitive dressed in respectability, waiting for the world to forget what built his empire. By 2020, Europe's criminal world had already been reshaped by encrypted phones and coded messages. Men like Liam Byrne thrived in the silence those devices provided: communication without trace, instructions without consequence. But that illusion of invisibility shattered when EncroChat was hacked. In a single operation, the UK's National Crime Agency uncovered millions of messages, revealing the hierarchy of drug lords, hitmen, and smugglers who once thought their phones were safe. Within those digital threads, investigators found something unexpected. Byrne's circle, speaking in code names, planning with precision. Their conversations were cold, businesslike, never emotional, proof of a machine that ran without conscience. And from that moment, the mask of secrecy that had shielded Byrne for years began to crack wide open. Through the decoded messages, agents pieced together a web connecting Dublin, Birmingham, and Manchester. Each message hinted at coordination between powerful men already under surveillance. One of them was Thomas "Bomber" Kavanagh, Byrne's brother-in-law and longtime ally, imprisoned yet still pulling strings. Another was Sean Kent, a trusted associate with the mobility to move weapons and cash between borders. Together, they discussed a plan that seemed, at first glance, like cooperation with the law, a proposal to hand over hidden firearms to the authorities. But beneath that surface, there was deception. Their idea was to create a false trail, to mislead investigators into believing they were helping dismantle the network, while secretly ensuring their own protection. The plan was bold, but it was also dangerous. They intended to locate and recover caches of weapons scattered across the UK, Ireland, and even parts of the Netherlands, then present them as newly discovered evidence. In their minds, this staged cooperation could soften Kavanagh's prison term and strengthen Byrne's negotiation leverage in ongoing investigations. Yet, as the encrypted chats unfolded, law enforcement saw through the act. The guns were not being surrendered, they were being shifted, hidden again, prepared for reuse. When the National Crime Agency traced the movements and seized one of the shipments, the scale of the operation became undeniable. They uncovered machine pistols, assault rifles, and boxes of ammunition, all connected through the same invisible digital fingerprints that once made the gang feel untouchable. As agents moved in, the illusion of control dissolved. Byrne, still operating from outside, watched his network crumble from within. For the first time, his own system of trust betrayed him. The technology he relied on turned into evidence. Each encrypted message now read aloud in court carried his voice without him ever speaking. The evidence painted a portrait of a man too confident in his reach, too careless with his shadows. Even behind bars, his influence was clear, his orders followed. It proved what the world suspected but could never prove until now. Liam Byrne's empire didn't need his presence to function. It only needed his name. And when the sting finally flipped, it wasn't just the weapons that were seized. It was the illusion of invincibility that Byrne had spent decades building. If you're still watching, hit the like button. It helps others discover the story behind Europe's invisible war on organized crime. June 2023 marked the moment when the walls finally closed in. After years of evading justice across borders, Liam Byrne's freedom ended under the Spanish sun. He had been living quietly in Majorca, surrounded by luxury but shadowed by surveillance. The UK's National Crime Agency had already mapped his movements, tracing money, messages, and meetings that painted a picture of a man who still controlled his empire from afar. When Spanish police moved in, they found him calm, expressionless, almost resigned. There was no chase, no gunfire, just the quiet surrender of a man who knew the system was closing fast. His arrest warrant came from the United Kingdom, not Ireland, a signal that the British courts now wanted their turn at the man who had built his wealth on deceit, intimidation, and strategy. What followed was an extraordinary show of international collaboration. The National Crime Agency in London, the Spanish Guardia Civil, and Ireland's Garda Síochána worked together in rare synchrony to secure his extradition. It was a quiet acknowledgement that Byrne was not just an Irish problem. He was a European one. His name had appeared in too many files, too many encrypted exchanges, and too many bank transfers that crossed through legitimate businesses in London and Liverpool. Within weeks, the extradition request was granted. Byrne was flown under heavy guard to Britain, where the Old Bailey awaited him. The same man once seen in designer suits and tinted cars now stood in handcuffs, facing the blunt power of the British justice system. For the first time, he had no loyal soldiers, no coded phones, and no protection. By October 2024, his trial began at the Old Bailey, one of the most scrutinized in recent memory. The court was a theater of contrast. Byrne seated silently, flanked by officers, while prosecutors unfolded the story of deceit that had stretched across borders. The evidence showed coordination with his brother-in-law, Thomas "Bomber" Kavanagh, already serving a 21-year sentence, and Sean Kent, who helped move weapons and money through hidden routes. The plan was exposed as a cynical manipulation of justice. According to the presiding judge, the scheme to fake cooperation with law enforcement by surrendering hidden weapons backfired spectacularly. The court heard of machine guns, handguns, and ammunition, tools of fear that had terrorized communities for years. The judge's words were cold, deliberate, and final. 5 years in prison for conspiring to acquire and conceal deadly weapons, a sentence that reflected both his guilt and his influence. But justice didn't bring closure, it brought questions. With time served and deductions for his guilty plea, Byrne's sentence suddenly seemed short. Legal experts warned that his release could come as early as late 2025. For many watching, it was a bitter echo of the past. Another powerful figure appearing to slip through the cracks. The outrage was loud, yet it couldn't change the math of the law. Byrne was sent to a secure facility, where he would serve his remaining term. Inside, he kept his silence, refusing interviews, writing nothing, speaking rarely. But those who knew his history understood that silence didn't mean surrender. It meant calculation. The same calm that defined his arrest now defined his confinement. And as months passed, something began to feel inevitable. The clock was ticking, and when the door finally opened, the world would once again see the man it thought it had locked away. The calendar, it seemed, moved faster than the outrage. And soon the prison door opened. It was a crisp autumn evening in Liverpool, the kind that carries a chill deep enough to make breath visible in the floodlights. Anfield was alive with noise, chants, scarves, and the pulse of a city that breathes football like religion. But as the cameras panned across the stands, they caught a face that didn't belong to that moment of joy. Liam Byrne, calm, composed, watching the match like any ordinary man. But there was nothing ordinary about his presence. The image spread within minutes, a quiet shockwave that crossed borders. The Irish tabloids called it his return from the shadows. British outlets questioned how a man once labeled one of Europe's most dangerous crime figures was already walking freely in public. It wasn't just a photograph, it was a statement, and everyone knew it. Byrne looked different. Older, leaner, but untouched by remorse. He wore a designer jacket, the same subtle show of wealth that had followed him from Dublin to Birmingham. He chatted casually with an older man beside him, his expression unreadable, his confidence unshaken. Yet the truth behind that smile was layered with restrictions. His freedom wasn't total, it was conditional. Under his early release terms, he was required to wear an electronic tag, live under home curfew, and avoid all contact with known associates of the Kinahan network. But there he was, seated in a crowd visibly relaxed, as if those rules no longer applied. For law enforcement, the photo was both proof of life and a reminder that control over men like Byrne never lasts long. For the public, it was infuriating. A man who had helped shape a decade of bloodshed now cheering from the stands like nothing had ever happened. The media storm was immediate and relentless. Byrne's reappearance at that football match was more than coincidence. It was symbolism. It told the world that no matter how many arrests or trials come, figures like him always find a way to step back into the light. History has shown that gang empires rarely retire quietly. They transform, shift hands, or simply change faces. And as cameras flashed that night at Anfield, one truth settled like fog over Liverpool and Dublin alike. Every photograph tells a story, and this one isn't finished yet. What do you think his appearance means? Was it a signal or simply a man watching football? Subscribe to stay updated when new developments drop, because in the underworld of organized crime, endings are rarely what they seem.